So then we are back with more understandings from the renewed covenant, and the translation used is from the Aramaic English translation, the closest you can ever get from the original manuscripts. And after making an evaluation of the existing manuscripts, it's very interesting the influence of Ruach HaKodesh and what he shows and what he indicates regarding then what so many people think that the Shilishim went through in the first 100 years of the dispensation of Ruach HaKodesh, with the understanding of then the functions of the Shilishim and their directives given to the Gentiles, and also the recording of such directives. And it is very true regarding the renewed covenant that most of the understandings and the delegations and the revelations and the functions and the anointings and also the many miracles involved in the renewed covenant, those are for the set apart Hebrews. It's 100% sure, nearly 100. If you begin to evaluate the areas, for instance, Ruach HaKodesh and the Acts, then you begin to understand those were then areas of Ruach HaKodesh in the lives of the Shilishim that came from the original line. Then when you read Hebrews, those are the updates of the tabernacle. Then if you move forward, then you find then Yaakov, or most knownly as James, but doesn't exist James. It was made it up. The name is Yaakov. He was the brother of the Mashiach. And the entire megilah of Yaakov is 100% for the set apart, or then the Hebrew line or the Hebraic people, while discovering themselves their new role in the tabernacle and also in the second service, and their positions and their functions. So then if you move forward, then you find Shimon later, then the first Megillah and the second Megillah of Shimon. Those are mostly for the set apart, 99% of each. Then when you find Yehuda also gives you 99% for the set apart and shows you the people on their way to form another holy land. And then if you maintain the reading, then you find more information. And then Romans, he then was writing, Shaul was writing to those Gentiles. Okay? The Romans were Gentiles, but then there were also set apart people over there. So he was then writing to them. So mostly it's set apart. If you maintain then the reading, then you find Corinthians, then you find Ephesians. Most of those are for the set apart. And then you begin to understand then that those Gentiles and then also the set apart, they begin to be not mixed, but they begin then to relate in the same reference point as in the Mashiach. So then there was a transitional time from the first service and the second service. Most importantly, they begin to delineate the positions of Gentiles versus set apart. And contrary of what most people they think, that the anointing was then badly influenced by the end of the first 100 years. In fact, it is the contrary. Because the understandings of the renewed covenant, they are related with a transitional time. If you begin to read, for instance, the 4 Gospels, those are 4 viewpoints of the same relink. It relinks the spirit back with the soul and the body, so they are then related as they were before. The spirit is born again. If you maintain your reading then in Acts, you find then the Acts of Ruach HaKodesh. Later then you find in Hebrews then the updates of the first service for the second service. And then you find a transitional time from first to second amongst the set-apart people themselves. And then you find a portion of it for the Gentiles, but only the behavioral guidelines, and they themselves living by faith, in other words, in what the Messiah told them to do. But the spiritual substance of the renewed covenant, those are for the set apart. So then not only they would be receiving Ruach HaKodesh, because a lot of them, they were yet under the Torah justice. So they would maintain the Torah, but they would include grace in the midst of it. So then when they receive the grace because of what they did to the Messiah, try to understand, we are speaking of the set apart and not Gentiles. The set apart, they had to receive the grace and mercy because they had then received then the pardon from on high for what they did to the Messiah. At the moment they did, then they would receive Ruach HaKodesh. So then they began then to function amongst the 7 functions of Ruach HaKodesh. But then they were not yet in their camps. So they were discovering their second services functions. Because they would go around the world forming holy lands, and they were then directing themselves, and it was then a transitional time. So then when you maintain the reading, then you find a whole lot more, many information regarding this topic, because every time the words are directed to the Gentiles are always in the level of behavior, never in the level of the spirit. Because the Gentiles, they were to be shepherded. And then the set apart, they were the shepherds. So then, contrary to what the people they think, when then the first 100 years came, it was then the very time then the camps were the most strong. So most people, they have the perception of then being the most troublesome times when then the anointing became so badly wasted and became very worn out. And it is the contrary, because after the first 100 years, then they were the most strong. Because we must understand there were areas where they were persecuted, and there were areas where they thrive. A lot, in fact. Because we must establish a area of formation in our minds of steps of formation, how then Asia became so prosperous, and it had to have a continuous basis of directives. Every time they were moving towards the future, there were new problems that came to their countries, but they were constantly being directed. There were problems, for instance, in Rome and the area of the Roman Empire, because of then Constantine was a true scoundrel. He murdered his own wife and his elder son because he was changing then the worship, and then he began to impose some changes. But then outside of the area, there were other places in Asia that then the camps, they thrived. This is absolutely true, because Yohanan, when he was then in the mainland, he was not in the island when he wrote Revelation. So what gives us the bad and contrary thinking is because we think Yohanan was then writing from the island. What comes to our mind is then the faith was then confiscated and they were disbanded, when the contrary is true. Because from the viewpoint of the understanding, when Shaul he shipwrecked in Malta, what was then the procedure of the soldiers? They withdrew their swords to slaughter the prisoners, was it not? So then what does it say? Yohanan, when he went to the island, he couldn't have released himself from it and then going to the mainland to prophesy upon the nations, as it is stated in the 10th chapter of Revelation and the 10th verse. So then this factor is discarded. So what does it say? He was in the mainland, very much protected, and he was in a camp, and he was encircled with absolutely functioned and absolutely sensed, very highly perfected in the second service. And what we do not have available is the second set of the writings of the megillahs. It was kind of amazing. After studying a bit the word and making inquiries, came to my understanding that there were a second set of the megillahs, and those sets, they were then recorded when the camps were then in place. Because what we have available is the transitional time. As you would think of a manufactory that would manufacture the product, and you have a transitional time, and you are then placing together the equipment, but then you don't find then the last final portion of it. As how would this machine, after being put together, would function? Let's say if you would be building radios, you go to the production line, you produce the radio, but you don't turn it on. This is what we have in our hands today regarding the renewed covenant. We have up to a point where then the camps were absolutely perfected during the time, but then we don't have the rest of the megillahs indicating what then they did after being functioned and trained and sensed and then truly directing the nations. We don't have those megillahs anymore, but they were in circulation during the time. Parts of them were burned in the Alexandrian library, parts of them were then confiscated later. But there was a period of time where the camps, they were very much active, and they began truly to direct the nations as the nations came to them for direction. So the contrary that most people think, at the very end, Yohanan, he was the last Shaliach, but then we must understand this factor. It is true that the camps were persecuted, but his time before he went to the island was the most strong and the most active of the camps. He was then caught because he was caught outside of the camp while he was preaching, while he was teaching. Then the nations were afraid, because contrary to what many people think, they thought Yohanan wanted to take over their thrones. But then Yohanan had no desire of taking their thrones, because he knew his role was simply to mention the kingdom to come government. And then he went to the island of Patmos, and there he died, and from there he never wrote. So then when we begin to understand the principles of the Word, then we find the four links, we find his ascension, we find then the acts of Ruach HaKodesh, then you find the delegation of the responsibilities, but these delegations of the responsibilities are after then the set apart received the Ruach HaKodesh, and they found themselves then functioning. 7 spirits of Elohim, 7 functions. And then they begin to organize themselves, and then if you begin to read each of these megillahs, for instance, Galatia started as a congregation and ended up as a camp. Ephesians started as a congregation, ended up as a camp. Do you want a reason for it? If you read Revelation, then you find, and the church that's in Ephesus. But then the church word does not exist. What was the first anointing of the second service in a camp, in a tabernacle. And then the other megillahs, each of those then you find camps later. So it started as a congregation and then later became a camp. However, the congregation yet existed, but was outside of the camp in a level of Gentiles. But the directives were given by the camps. And then what we do not have in hand are then the directives after the camps were perfected, because there were many of them. We understand the physical part of it, of then the outside of the camps, and then we draw our conclusions based upon what we understand in a physical level. In other words, those nations involved with the camps. But we don't take the understanding of the camps themselves being spiritual directors. Because Yohanan, he was only a person that was caught outside of the camp. Because when he received the revelations up to the 10th chapter, we understand he went out and he began to prophesy. The camp was then yet protected. And the other camps were also protected. So much is when he went to the island, he died over there and he never gave out a word. He was tortured and he was murdered. He didn't give a word. So with this understanding in mind, because it was not then a situation that he would jeopardize the work on the mainland, that's why he didn't say a word. Shows you that then the camps in the mainland, they were very strong and very active, and there were many megillahs around circulating. And we don't have those recorded megillahs anymore. But then we begin to understand the steps of formation up to this point and the reasons where they were and why they were at. So then you begin to understand, then step by step, or in quote, the evolution, or then the furtherance of the anointing and then the faith of the Gentiles. So there were other areas and other megillahs making a second set of the renewed covenant. We simply don't have those anymore, but they existed. It's amazing what Ruach HaKodesh can reveal. Absolutely amazing. And those words, step by step by step, after reading for so long, and then, of course there were more megillahs. So what we have is a transitional time. We have then the understanding of most of the renewed covenants for the set apart, and then they find themselves receiving Ruach HaKodesh, discovering themselves their position in the second service. They received then the first anointing. They began to function and organize themselves into camps. But then, when the camps are in place, then we don't have the records. As you would then produce radios in a line, and then you never turn it on. Makes it the reading a whole lot more interesting, because then we know for sure that the functions of Ruach HaKodesh were very active during the time. And as contrary as we think, because of Yohanan, he went to the island while he was caught outside of the camp. The camps were persecuted much later. Much later. But while the camps, they were very active, there were thousands of megillahs everywhere. And we don't have those recordings anymore. We may be able to find someday in the sands of the desert, but at the moment what we have is the surety of then understanding the renewed covenant from the Aramaic translation as a production of equipment, and then at the end, when the product is finished, then the test results were not done. This is what we have in our hands. So when we begin to understand from the perspective of faith, we must not make a confusion, because there is the faith level and then the set apart anointed level. Okay? The faith level regarding the Gentiles, they were persecuted. They were persecuted in many areas. So what people they think it was the end was then related with the Gentiles, but not the camps. The camps were very active, however, they were neutral. They were not imposing upon other countries or other nations. The nations would come to them. That's why the camps were so nicely maintained for many centuries. The problem came when Gentiles, they began then to impose themselves upon other people. Not the set apart. The set apart, they were in their camps. They were told not to do it, but then a lot of the Gentiles, they began to take upon themselves some sort of false ministry, and they began to impose upon others. That's why they were persecuted. And granted, some of those people were also involved with the paganism and trying to make those a mixture of them. That's when you find then the, in quote, erosion of the faith, but you won't find the erosion of the anointing. The anointing were in the camps. So please stay tuned, much more coming up, because we may find more information from other Megillahs related with then the final understanding and recordings of the many miracles and directives of other nations, while then the camps were very active. Please stay tuned.